Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anamika Chatterjee, and I edit Khalij Times Weekend magazine. With me is a musician, a poet, a novelist, all rolled into one, Jeet Thayil. So, a big round of applause for him.
Or even a small round. It's fine. How come you get the lapel mic and I get one of these?
Uh, because I'm a woman.
Fair enough. Good answer. I'm happy with that.
Okay, Jeet, first question, which I'm sure nobody would have asked you. You were a poet. What drove you to novels, to writing novels?
I wrote 5 books of poetry,
Yes.
like throughout my teens and 20s and 30s. And then I think around the age of 40 something, I finally saw the light. And I realized I can never make a living out of poetry. So, if I want to be a writer full time, I better come to my senses and write some other things as well. So that's when I began to write novels.
How did the poet in you influence your writing as a novelist?
I really honestly don't make a huge difference between different kinds of writing. I don't think of poetry as one thing and fiction as something else, and that there can be no overlap between those things. I just see it all as writing. So I hope that there's some poetry in the fiction, and I hope that there's some. In fact, I know that there's fiction in the poetry.
Now, Narcopolis deep dives into the Bombay of 70s, into the dark underbelly of Bombay. How would you say, and you've mapped the city's transformation over the decades, what went into the research of, of that book as far as the city is concerned?
Well, I was in Bombay in the 70s and the 80s. And when I came to write about the city in 2005, I never thought of those years as research. I mean, I was kind of in the middle of it, but it turned out that it was absolutely research. And the thing is, if you were writing a book about Bombay in the 70s and you wanted to research it, and you were to go online, say, or you were to go to a library and look for books and photographs from that time, you would get a very good idea of what the city looked like. But I don't think you'd get an idea of what it smelt like or felt like or tasted like. So when I came to write about it 30 years after the fact, I think what I tried to do really was to imagine what it was like to be inside it. And because that's what makes a novel much realer, or makes fiction truer than non-fiction, which sounds like a paradox, but it really isn't. Fiction can tell you things about a time and a place or a person that journalism cannot.
Okay.
I mean, not that I have anything against journalists. I was one for 20 years, so you have my condolences.
Oh my God. Okay. Now, one would imagine, since there's so much of your own experience that has gone into Narcopolis, that writing the book would be cathartic, but you have maintained that it was anything but cathartic. How emotionally consuming was it for you to write the book way back then?
It took 5 years to write Narcopolis. Took 5 years to write, and I think there were moments during that 5 year period where I really didn't want to do it anymore, because I think it put me back into a place that I really didn't want to be in. Also, I just quit a job to write full time, and I didn't have much money. I was living in a tiny little place in Bombay, and I worked for 5 years on a novel that I had no guarantees about. I didn't know that anybody would even publish it, much less read it. So I think it was really difficult to kind of settle, to sink into that time, but I'm very glad I did it.
So after Narcopolis, when you wrote the book of Chocolate Saints,
Yeah.
was there any baggage of the mass adulation that Narcopolis got? It was shortlisted for Man Booker. So does mass adulation also bring with itself some sort of a pressure on a writer?
Yeah, they call it the curse of the second book. Because if you've written a first book and it gets a little attention, there's a lot of expectation. And I think that can really kind of, it can work against you. Uh, but you just have to power through it. And then I can say from bitter experience that the third book is much easier,
Which you are currently in the process of writing.
which I've just finished. I'm in the process now of writing the fourth one.
Okay. Different writers have different approaches towards writing. Some novelists will tell you that the characters continue to stay with them. And some writers, like Orhan Pamuk was here, he was like, once he finishes a book, it's just a closed chapter. He doesn't go back to it. He doesn't think about the characters. What is it like for you? Is being a novelist a very lonely job?
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it helps to be insane a little bit to be a novelist.
Insane.
Insane, yeah, which Orhan Pamuk certainly is. Because, what you're doing really is you're living with people who don't exist for years on end. You're having conversations with people who don't exist in your own head. And it's a conversation that goes back and forth with an imaginary person. If that isn't a definition of insanity, I don't know what is.
But at times the real challenge of writing a book, and I'm referring to Narcopolis here, is that you take so much from your personal experiences that being completely objective about the subject becomes a challenge. Did you ever was that ever a concern for you?
Not really, no. I was trying to be true to a certain time and place. And the wonderful thing about it was that it had nothing to do with me. I felt I was just subsumed under this kind of bigger story, and under the city, really. It was the city that is the true hero of Narcopolis. It's not the writer.
The early reviews of the book, in one of your many interviews, you say that the early reviews of the book weren't really showering praises on it. Then
that's a very kind way to put it. No, actually, they were really insulting. Let's be honest. Yeah.
So, and then the Western critics praised it to high heavens, and that's when the reviews back in India changed.
Overnight.
Right? Overnight.
Yeah.
What does it say about the reviewing culture in general about?
I don't think it says something about reviewing culture. I think it says something about Indians. And it says something very, very terrible about Indians, and that is, we don't know our own minds. We have no opinions. We don't know what is good or bad until somebody in the West tells us, preferably somebody white, tells us, oh, this is good, this is bad, then we're full of enthusiasm for the good, and we will ignore the bad. I think it's just a kind of an indictment about the fact that colonialism is not dead. It's alive and well and living in India.
But at the same time, literary criticism, and there is a difference between book reviews and literary criticism. Where does that stand today in India?
Okay, fine, you asked for it, I don't think there is literary criticism in India. There are book reviews.
Yeah.
There is no criticism. There's literary criticism is a whole different thing from reviewing a book. I've been a journalist and I've reviewed books in India, so I know what it's like. The editor gives you a book, like, for example, a 600-page novel, and asks for a 800-word review in 4 days. This is standard practice. This happens all the time.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah. So do you think that that writer is going to actually read the review? I don't think so.
Read the book, you mean?
I mean, sorry, read the book before they write the review. Absolutely not. In fact, what they do is they Google it. They Google the book. They Google the writer. They read all the other reviews. And then they bang out something. Which is why when you publish a book in India, it's incredible how similar the reviews are. Like, the one review appears, and that reviewer uses the word, for example, misogyny, and uncannily, every review that follows uses the word misogyny, because they're all just copying each other. Nobody actually has time to read 600 pages, think about it, come up with some original ideas, put it down, fashion that bit of 500 words, polish it, and then publish it. Of course not. Anyway, they're only being paid about 1,200 rupees. Why should they bother? Nobody cares. So you just read the 3 other people who have reviewed the book, copy it, bang it out. I don't call that literary criticism. In fact, I don't even think it should be called book reviewing.
Wow.
Yeah, what would you call it? I would call it cheating or something. I'd call it just pointless. I would say don't review a book. Don't bother. Don't waste the reader's time.
Do you think one bad review today can actually cause far greater damage to a book?
Absolutely not. Nobody cares. Nobody reads reviews. So Narcopolis got only bad reviews in India because it was first published in India before it appeared in the UK and the US and in other places. So for about 3 months, there were only Indian reviews about Narcopolis available online. One of those reviews said, and I quote, and I will always remember these words because they're so amazing. The reviewer said, "This is the worst novel published in the English language anywhere." And the word that caught my attention in that sentence was the word anywhere. Because did that mean that the reviewer had read every single book published in the English language throughout history all over the world? I was so impressed by that assertion that I tried to get my publisher to use that line as a blurb in the following edition, because that's a hell of a qualification. The worst novel published in the English language anywhere?
Razzie Award for Literature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the publisher wouldn't agree to do it.
Also, now you're not writing poetry anymore, right? Do you miss?
No.
Do you miss writing poetry? Do you miss verse?
Not really, no. There's a lot of poetry in the novels. I sometimes actually write poems and weave it into the novel. And I work as a musician, so I write song lyrics, which are often similar to poems. So, yeah, I don't, been there, done that, really.
In another interview, you have been critical about literary cliques. But when Narcopolis was shortlisted for Man Booker, a lot of praise came your way. So, and inadvertently, it also paved the way for you to be part of that clique. Do you think cliques in general, literary cliques are very infamous as it is, do you think cliques can really hinder a writer's prospects?
Oh, for sure. When I was young and writing poems in Bombay was pretty much, even the poets, which is really surprising, even poetry was kind of run by a clique. And if you, and if you didn't kind of turn up and pay obeisance, you were kept out of it, you know, out of publication, out of so many things. So, but in a way also, I think especially for a young poet, I think that's excellent training to be rejected, to be dejected, to be suppressed, to be repressed, to be depressed. I think this is great training for a poet because it really shows you what the future will hold, you know. Uh, and if you continue to do it, and there are people crazy enough to continue to write poetry despite all the difficulties that that project throws up in its wake, those people, I think, are the ones who last. Because you really need a will of iron to continue to write poems.
Do you think a novelist, a writer in today's world is also obliged to be political?
I don't know how it's possible not to be political in today's world, especially. I mean, you could say art for art's sake and that you're only interested in producing art for art's sake, but I don't think it's possible. Somehow, your situation, your politics, the world that you live in will seep into the work, and I think that's only right. I think when you see something where there's no sense of the outside, I find that a kind of a disadvantage in a work of art.
See, Narcopolis was also dedicated. The first page of Narcopolis is dedicated to HCV, which is hepatitis C virus. What is the story behind it? I mean, it's a very unusual thing.
How did you know that it was the hepatitis C virus?
I think you have spoken about it earlier.
Damn, what a big mistake. Yeah, it was dedicated to HCV because I was diagnosed with hepatitis C in 2002. And I think that diagnosis kind of changed my life. I cleaned myself up, I stopped drinking, I changed my life in many ways. And I think that is what made me get serious about finally writing a novel. So I thought it was only right to dedicate it to the virus, except that at that time, hepatitis C was incurable. It ended in liver failure and cirrhosis. There was no cure for it, but last year, the year before, they found a kind of a miracle cure. So, yeah, I did it. Maybe now I'll stop writing novels, who knows?
What sort of influence has your father had on your writings?
Tremendous, I think. I mean, for many years I wasn't willing to accept that. Because, you know, especially if your father is a kind of very well known in his field, young writers are always fighting against that kind of shade, you know. So it took me a long while to come around, and now I so appreciate what he did, which is that when I was growing up and when I was a teenager, I grew up in a house full of books. And although to this day he still says, poetry, I don't like poetry, I don't understand any of it, I'd never read it because I don't understand it. His library was full of books of poems. And the first poetry I ever read was books from his library, including, in fact, the first book of poems I remember reading in a very serious way was the collected poems of Dylan Thomas. And he had a first edition. He also had a first edition of Ulysses. He had the Russian novelists. It was really such an education, that library. And also I grew up listening to, my father had a job as a journalist. Then he would come home and write a book, write the book that he was working on. So in those days, of course, it was typewriters. So I grew up with the sound of the typewriter at night, and I still find it a very soothing kind of sound. It can put me to sleep instantly, the sound of a typewriter. But I think, in a way, just the idea of growing up in the presence of somebody who wrote all day, whose life was writing, I think was tremendously useful for me.
You've also been very influenced by Naipaul.
I mean, I love him and I hate him too.
Can you explain your love and hatred for him?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no question that he was an awful man. He was just the worst kind of human that it's possible to be, especially in his relationship with women. There's the great story by James Wood, which appeared in the New Yorker decades ago, where he describes going to Wiltshire to visit Naipaul. And he's led into the house by this woman, and Naipaul and he sit and have a conversation. He interviews Naipaul. When lunch is ready, this lady comes out, the housekeeper, comes out and says lunch is ready and invites them to lunch. And they go into the other room and they sit down and they eat. And afterwards, they continue the conversation over coffee, which the housekeeper serves. And then, as James Wood is leaving to go back to London, Naipaul introduces the housekeeper as his wife, Pat. And until then, Wood had no idea that the housekeeper was actually his wife, because they didn't exchange a word. She was not introduced. And that's just one of the, like, 100 terrible stories about Naipaul in terms of humanity and in terms of a man. Like, for example, when Pat was dying, when his wife was dying of cancer, he gave an interview and told the press that that he had been seeing prostitutes throughout his life. And and of course it was front page news in newspapers all over the world. His wife saw the headlines. It just seemed like a really cruel and unnecessary thing to do to somebody. But of course the thing was, he had a new book out, and he was always a smart enough kind of marketing mind to know that when you have a new book out, you should say something controversial that will put your name in the news and that will make people buy your book. And he had a knack of doing this every time a new book would come out. Like, a book came out and he said, Jane Austen, he said women didn't know how to write. Jane Austen was a terrible writer. No woman has written a great book. He said this. It, of course, became headlines all over the world. It was fabulous advertising for his book. So the thing is, I'm just saying these things because there's no question that as a man, as a human, he was really not a role model. In fact, he's an awful example of a human. But the problem is, when you come to the writing, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's full of tenderness. It's full of all the tenderness that he was incapable of in his life with the people closest to him. He was so cruel with people closest to him, but when it came to the work was full of beauty and tenderness and just the sharpest kind of intelligence. And I mean, all of those things are true, but what really made me admire him, I think, was or is the quality of his sentences. And I was aware of that from the first time I read him, which was at about the age of 16, when I read Area of Darkness, the second India book. Yeah.
Jeet, you made a very interesting point, because as readers, when we read a book by an author, which is a work of fiction, we tend to believe that there is a part of the author, the way he thinks, that is there in the book. So can that be completely false? Like a man, for instance, you gave Naipaul's example. I mean, a brilliant writer, but a not so brilliant human being. So can the writing be completely separate from the person that a writer is?
Of course. In fact, I think that's always the case. The work has nothing to do with the person, you know. Some of the most awful people in history were amazing artists. Uh, Look at the poets, the painters. If you were to not, or if you were to delete the work, which is, of course, in today's culture, it's what we try and do. We try and delete people and delete work, right? Uh, you know, you mustn't see a movie by Woody Allen because he's such an awful human being. You can't watch a movie by Roman Polanski. Well, in that case, if you were to actually go through history, and it's not just men, there are women on that list too. So much of the best work in our history and our culture would be negated, would be wiped out. I think that's a mistake, you know. It's possible to appreciate a piece of writing or a painting or a piece of music or a movie without liking the person who produced it. And liking a piece of work, a piece of art, doesn't mean that you're endorsing the person or his politics. You know, I don't see why we have to be so literal and so close-minded and so full of judgment and so unforgiving. You know, I mean, it just, of course, it's a personal choice. You're allowed to be as unforgiving as you want. And if you're not, you know, you can't be on Twitter. You have no life on Twitter because Twitter is all about anger and rage and going after people.
You're on Twitter.
I quit, actually, a year ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Best thing I ever did. Twitter really is for the birds. You know, it's the sound that birds make.
How much of yourself can we see in the characters that you have created in your novels? In Narcopolis, apart from Dom, and in the book of Chocolate Saints, apart from Xavier. So how much of yourself can we see in your characters?
I don't think there's much of myself in either of those characters either. I mean, when you're writing a novel, you have a story, you have certain characters, and you tell the story with those characters, and of course, parts of you go into each of them. But I think it's a mistake to think that it's entirely autobiographical. I think an entirely autobiographical novel would be unbearable. I don't think it'd be interesting at all. You know, because, I mean, it would be banal, wouldn't it?
True. What did the Booker shortlist all those years back change for the writer in you, if anything at all?
It made the second book. In fact, the second book, the Book of Chocolate Saints, took 6 years to write. Because I think, you know, I had so much to prove. And I was kind of, and I mean, this is really something nobody should do. I set out to write a kind of an epic, a masterpiece, you know. And that is a way of really shooting yourself in the foot, because it's giving yourself so much, it's loading yourself with so much pressure that it's just a terrible thing to do to yourself, you know. Yeah.
You know, Pamuk said something interesting, that when you write the first draft of your novel, you look at it poetically, but once you're done, you look at it through an engineer's prism. You know, you're more, you know, you have a clinical precision about the writing. What is your process like, writing process?
It's similar to writing a poem. The first draft is always longer. It's full of things that even while I'm writing, I have doubts about. I don't know if it should really be there. You know, I overwrite, and then by the second or the third draft, I've just pared it down with Chocolate Saints. I deleted about 50,000 words. It would have been a much larger book, and I think that would have been a huge mistake. But I think it became much tighter and much faster paced and much easier to read because of those deletions.
How self-critical are you once your book is book has published?
Once it's published, I'm not critical. But before, I'm more critical than the guy who said this is the worst novel published in the English language anywhere.
You will not forget that. You will
Yeah,
not
no,
forget or
because
forgive.
yeah, no. Well, also when I'm, reading the first draft, I feel that way too. The worst. What a mistake. Why did delete, delete, delete?
Uh, where do you think contemporary Indian writing in English is headed?
To a precipice, I think, and then into the abyss.
Why do you say so?
Ah, I think. I mean, you see kind of glimmers of light in the darkness, but I think there's this whole kind of exotic, uh, this baggage of exotica that's attached to the notion of being an Indian writer, where Indian writers think that because they write and because they're Indian, they have to have things like monsoons, rain. There must be rain. And the rain must fall on a sari, And it must fall on the sari, and then it must fall in gravel, and it must make that sound, you know. And and then there must be mangoes, and the mangoes must be cooked in a curry, and the curry, it must be specified every spice that goes into the curry, and then there must be some words in a language that nobody understands except the writer. And of course, there has to be a big family, and there has to be a lot of drama within that family, but always love and tenderness, and loving parents, and loving grandparents. The point is, this is complete nonsense. This is not real life. This is fabrication. These are lies that Indian writers feel they must tell each other. I think it's time we got over that and wrote real books.
Real books, I mean, can you elaborate on that?
Real books that say what actually happens in an Indian family. I mean, it's often bloodier than the worst thriller you could read, than the worst crime novel you could read.
Digitalization has enabled some sort of instant consumption, We now have Insta poetry, Insta poets becoming, stars and global celebrities. How do you think the poetry as a form and novel as a form, how do you think they need to be, do they need to be tweaked in order to cater to the sensibilities of people who are exposed to this digital platform?
Why not? There's a publisher in India that publishes novels to be read on your phone.
Jagannath.
Yeah. So whenever I hear that word, I think of Jagannath. So you get it, you download a chapter, and then you read it on the screen of your phone, page by page. I mean, I think that people actually do read novels that way, but I would hate it. I guess, it's also generational and to do with age, but I certainly like the feel of paper in my hands.
And it also allows room for considered writing, a novel.
And considered reading.
True.
You can go back, you can flip back a few pages or flip ahead. You can skip bits. You can read bits again. It's tactile. There's a smell involved and touch involved. It's far more human and sensual and interesting than reading something on a screen.
So I'm a Bengali, and while I was researching, I was doing some research on him, I came across an interview where he says that Rabindranath Tagore is the most overrated poet.
In India?
In India, and it felt like a dagger had been stabbed into my heart. Why do you think Tagore is overrated?
You know, I've never received death threats until I said that. It's really quite a revelation how violent Bengalis can be when you attack Tagore. You know, they don't mind anything else. You can insult Rasgullas, you can
Yeah,
insult
that's
Calcutta, no, you can insult communism, you can insult fish, no problem, but don't touch Tagore. My problem really with Tagore is that I think as an artist, as a composite artist, he's one of the great artists. But what I mean is, as a lyricist, as a visual artist, as a poet, and as a short story writer. When you put all of that together, he's amazing. But when you separate it, if you look at him purely as a poet, absolutely overrated. And the most overrated poems are the ones everyone knows by heart. You know, there's no Indian school kid who doesn't know the poem that goes, when the head is held high and the mind is without fear. But if you think of those lines, when the head is held high and the mind is without fear, 13 syllables, it's not poetry, actually, it's prose. And it's not even interesting prose. It's a dead line. That line doesn't live. But you know, that's purely my opinion. I might be
sorry, I
wrong.
just froze for a second.
Yeah.
So,
I didn't mean it.
no Bengalis here, I'm guessing.
Oh, then I did mean it.
You know, your next novel is about Bombay. What is it with Bombay?
You're welcome to.
What is it about Bombay that is that you keep going back to the city as a theme, as a setting for your novels?
I think it's just one of those cities that was meant to either be photographed or filmed because it's so photogenic. You can just you can fall over your shoelaces and by accident click your phone and you'll come out with a great photograph. The buildings are amazing, especially in some parts of Bombay. Ditto with film and with poems and with fiction. It lends itself to a certain kind of art making, I think, because there's so much history there, and there are so many people living together in really difficult circumstances. You know, it's astonishing to think how Bombayites continue to live and to work despite the kind of daily hardship they face just in getting to work, for example, or in getting home, how much time that takes, how much effort and how much discomfort. But somehow they keep doing it. And it's because of that, it's an inspiring place. Of course, it's changed a lot in that in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s, it was an inclusive place. It welcomed everybody. It didn't matter what religion you were. It didn't matter what your surname was. None of those things mattered. If you were willing to work hard, if you had certain dreams, the city welcomed you and made you part of it. All of that changed, of course, once the Shiv Sena came into power and once those riots happened, and now it's a city of divisions. People are very aware of which religion the other person is. So I think that whole promise of Bombay has gone. And that's a tragedy. And I think possibly this next novel will be my last Bombay-centric novel.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? Or is it too early to speak?
No. It's a story about a man whose wife dies in Delhi, and he goes to the crematorium, and his mother-in-law, or former mother-in-law, splits the ashes into two boxes. He's given a white box, and then he walks out of the crematorium, takes a taxi home, and realizes the last thing he wants to do is go home, and tells the taxi to take him to the airport. And the taxi driver, being young, is horrified at this idea, says, I can't take you to the airport. It says defense colony, you have to change it on the app. So he changes it on the app, and in half an hour he's buying a ticket to Bombay because he wants to go to a city where he can immerse the ashes in clean and flowing water, as you do in the Hindu tradition. And of course, he knows that there's no water in Delhi, it's filthy. And he knows there's probably not clean flowing water in Bombay either, but it'll be easier to find than in Delhi. So he goes to Bombay, and the whole novel is 2 nights in the city, and it's really a portrait of self-destruction and grief. But I really don't want this to sound grim, because actually it's a kind of a black comedy. It's a comedy, really.
Will there be a happy novel coming from you anytime?
I doubt it. The one I'm working on now is called The Names of the Women, and it's a retelling of the New Testament. There's not much comedy there either.
I'm sure our audiences would love for you to, narrate something from your books, read some passages.
I'll read a poem.
Yeah.
This is called Malayalam's Ghazal. A ghazal is an Arabic invention, as we know. It's a poem in couplets that has a refrain and a rhyme, which is repeated at the end of each couplet. So the rhyme here is air, and the refrain is in Malayalam. I try not to read this poem in North India because in North India they get very upset if you write ghazals in any other language than Urdu or Hindi. And a ghazal with the title of Malayalam's Ghazal in English, it's, if you're reading this in North India, you have to be always ready to duck if someone's going to throw shoes at you. I'm hoping that won't happen today. If it does, just let me know. Malayalam's Ghazal. Listen, someone's saying a prayer in Malayalam. He says there's no word for despair in Malayalam. Sometimes at daybreak you sing a Gujarati garba. At night you open your hair in Malayalam. To understand symmetry, understand Kerala, the longest palindrome is there in Malayalam. When you've been too long in the rooms of English, open your windows to the fresh air of Malayalam. Visitors are welcome in the school of lost tongues. Someone's endowed a high chair in Malayalam. I greet you, my ancestors, O scholars and linguists, my father who recites Baudelaire in Malayalam. Jeet, such drama with the scraps you know. Write a couplet, if you dare, in Malayalam.
Now, questions from the audiences?
I want to welcome Jeet Thayil to Emirates. I've met him long time ago, 1988, and this is the first time I see him since then. I want to say his poetry influenced me so much. The sensitivity, the pain. I was searching for his poetry, and I translated some of his work to Arabic. And many people, from the poetry circle at least, are very familiar with his first poems, which I think he did not publish in English, but it got published in Arabic.
Probably because they were terrible.
No, no, they were great poems. But you know, you this sense of superiority, you do have it so since you were younger. The superiority of feeling that you want to be better than yourself, trying to match up with another image about what poetry means. But in reality, what I see in your first writings do relate to what I read lately for you, even in your novel. It is a poetic novel. It is written with the eyes of with the poet in Bombay. So much of what you said today is also part of this. But I want to welcome you and to say that the Indian literature, which we had followed, and some of it got translated to Arabic, is greatly appreciated. Although a lot of our work and our situation are interrelated, we are very similar. When you discussed India and literary criticism and the ceiling of what it means to be an Indian, it's also the same in the Arab world. We do interrelate in so many aspects. So welcome to Sharjah, welcome to Emirates, and I do love Dawood.
Thanks so much.
I am Chidambaram. Thomas Gray, he wrote Jude the Obscure, which was read by one reader. He later on burnt that book and sent the ashes to Thomas Gray. After Thomas Gray received that, he stopped writing novels and started writing poetry. So in your case, you switched the other way around. Do you think it is because of the times?
Thomas Gray's poems were actually a distillation of what he had done as a novelist. And I don't think he stopped writing novels because of that extreme bit of literary criticism. Because that's what it was. Somebody burnt Jude the Obscure, sent him the ashes. I mean, he could have written a review and said, this is the worst novel written in the English language anywhere so far or something. But instead, to be more violent, he burnt it, sent the ashes. The thing is, Thomas Gray, I think, was a far more serious writer and poet than to have allowed himself to be so affected by something like that. I think he had exhausted himself in terms of novels. And the poems that he wrote, in fact, were very narrative driven. They are the poems of a novelist, not the poems of a poet. And I think that's one of his great strengths. He brought all the kind of the structure, the stanzaic, the rhyming, the scansion, all of that to poetry. Technically, it was absolutely perfect. But what it did was tell a story in a way that the other poets of that time didn't do or were not as interested in doing. I think that's Thomas Gray's great kind of service to poems.
Here the Booker Prize was split. You were one of the judges there. What's your take on that?
I wasn't a judge there. I was there at the announcement. I'm a judge for the Booker Prize International, not for the Booker Prize. I was shocked and appalled when they split that prize, because actually it's against the rules. The rules say that you have to give it to one person. The last time they did that was in 1992, when they split the prize and gave it to Barry Unsworth and Michael Ondaatje. Of course, no one remembers Barry Unsworth today. We only remember Ondaatje, and he's the one who should have got that prize for the English patient. And at that point, they changed the rules. They said from now on, the Booker Prize can only go to one winner. And the jury this year actually broke the rules and insisted that the prize should go to two people because they didn't have the courage to give it to the writer that it should have gone to. That in fact, most of the judges wanted it to go to, and that was it, which is why they also included Margaret Atwood in that. It should have gone to Bernardine Evaristo. That's what I think. I think the jury failed in their job. They had one job, and that job was to give one winner the prize. They had 10 months to do it. They failed in their job, and I think there's just no excuse for it.
I'm Ronald from India.
Yeah.
I would like to address myself as a young poet and a writer. So I actually wanted a piece of advice from you. What is it to you, a writer's block? I wanted advice. How do you work past it? Is it okay to not write? And how often do you face writer's block?
I never face writer's block because I think it's an excuse that writers use when they're feeling lazy. I think it's just kind of a great thing to tell non-writers. The only people who believe the story about the writer's block, this kind of lie, this great fiction about the writer's block, are non-writers. Who, when you use the words writer's block, they'll think, oh, yeah, wow, because writing is so mysterious. It's such an amazing thing. Yeah, yeah. Of course, you know, you never know whether it's going to come. There might be days when it won't come. How come there's no carpenter's block? How come there's no tailor's block? How come there's no... Take any profession. How come they don't have blocks? Writing is a profession. You turn up every day at your desk and you get to work. That's all there is to it. Don't mystify it. Don't romanticize it. Don't fictionalize it. Don't come up with stories like writer's block. Just admit you'd rather be out playing. And I don't blame you. I would too.
Can I share another point?
Sure.
Don't you think punctuation, I mean commas and full stop, add beauty to a sentence or a story or a paragraph in that sense? So why can't we see writer's block in that sense? How beautiful it transforms the writer from what he is and what he's going to be.
I think you need applause for that one. That's a good one.
Thank you.
I think fiction is your métier.
Thank you.
If there was one grammatical error, what would be the one according to you?
You mean of all the grammatical errors, which is the most annoying, do you mean? I could fill a book. In fact, that might be a good idea for a book.
Yeah. And what I wanted to know was, when you was writing the first novel for 5 years, wasn't there some time when you don't have the money, say that I had enough, let me just stop from doing this? So how did you get over that and stick to it for the 5 years to write that first novel?
I think what really helped me was that I came to my first novel very, very, very late in life. I worked as a journalist for 23 years because I needed the money. And finally I quit, I think at the age of 44, and moved to India and lived very small, not with much money, at times with my parents, because as most of you know, one of the great advantages of being born Indian is you can always turn up at home. They will never throw you out, and they will always feed you and, you know, give you a place to stay. So, you know, I made full use of that. But I lived in Bombay for a while, tiny apartment on a very, very small income, writing this book for 5 years, because I think I'd reached a point of complete desperation. And I knew that if I didn't do it at this point, it was never going to happen. I'd been wanting to since I was a teenager, but I'd never had the time or the resources or the kind of mental stability, I think, to produce a work of fiction, which takes a while. You have to work on it every day. It's not like a poem that you can just bang out in a month or so. You have to really work at it, a long piece of fiction. And so when my book finally appeared, I was 51 years old when my first novel appeared. And I think in a way that was really useful to me because it made it so life and death that I had no choice. I could not afford the luxury of writer's block, for example. I had something to do and I had to finish it. There was no way around it. I couldn't make excuses. And I think that was the best thing really that could have happened. Also, you know, if you're working on a novel and it's a first novel and your friends, your family, you know, they ask you, say year one or year two, they ask you, so what are you doing? And you say, I'm working on a novel. And they'll say, oh, well, okay, all right. 2 years later, they ask you, what are you doing? And you say, I'm working on a novel. And you see this hint of like doubt in their eyes, you know. Ah, oh, right, okay, sure, you know. And so to continue to do that for 5 years, you have to have a will of iron. You have to believe in yourself at a time when no one believes in you, you know, because nobody knows what it is, whether it's going to be any good, what it might never be published. You really have to be desperate, I think.
I want to know what kind of music do you play or do you sing?
I do, yeah. I play guitar and I write songs and I am a vocalist in the band that I'm with.
So you have your own band doing it?
I do. I've had several bands, but at this point, it's a three-piece band based out of Bangalore.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
Anamika, so much for
May you
that
start
great
loving
conversation.
Tagore.
I'll try.